I didn't already.
Okay, I think we got it recording. Appreciate it. All right. So this is week 5 of the study on the seven-headed beast of Revelation 13. Really, this is a study of the large-scale biblical depiction of the transition from larger world history into the setting, the landscape, and political landscape of the world in the end times that the Bible depicts to us through a series of symbols connected in some particular chapters with real historical events and also compiled through extra biblical history to make these sort of deductions. And the model that we've been attempting to employ is to just stick to the Bible's use of these symbols and what it tells us about what these symbols mean, so that we can have a proper, again, modeling or understanding of the landscape before we attempt to identify particular countries or nations or regions that are going to be important in order so that our speculation about the identifications, the eventual realities that will unfold, doesn't interfere or bias us against or away from the biblical intentions. We start with the biblical mapping itself. Then when we see that recognizable picture emerging in the world landscape, then we should be able to correlate that. But if we bend our biblical understanding to match preconceived influences that may be more derived from our modern American 21st century Western traditions or experience that may not really be biblical in their basis, then we run the risk of being so committed and short-sighted or narrow in our view that we miss the reality when it starts to happen. And so we just want to be using the exercise of exegeting correctly and proper hermeneutics, letting the Bible tell us what it means rather than forcing the Bible to mean what we want it to mean. And so we've gone through that process. And last week, I'm just going to do a quick review of the last thing we talked about last week because it'll be relevant tonight. We talked about how the harlot city of Revelation 17 and 18, the great city that rules over the nations of the earth, has earlier precedent in terms of the Bible talking about and using that same terminology about a harlot city in previous periods and associating that terminology with the capitals of the same historical earthly empires that the Bible points out as those that are part of this prophetic series of 7 heads or kingdoms that ruled over, had dominion during the times when Israel was in the land with a temple and interacted with them during those periods. And so in the book of Nahum, chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, we see the application of that term, the harlot city, that concept, to Nineveh, the ancient capital of Assyria, and then an immediate comparison between Nineveh and Thebes, the capital of ancient Egypt, demonstrating that both of those cities were in that role of the harlot city in their time period, and is showing that association. And so we also see that in Revelation 17, one of the titles, the figurative titles for this harlot city at the end of the age is Babylon the Great, which invokes the idea that the city of Babylon itself during the Babylonian Empire served in this role or this capacity. And then in 1 Peter 5:13, we saw that the Apostle Peter, who at the end of his life is understood to have been in Rome, identifies his location as Babylon, indicating the application of that same kind of role to the city of Rome, the capital of the ancient Roman Empire at that time. And so the idea of a harlot city is not unique to the end times. What we're seeing in the end times in chapter 17 and 18 is a call out to the great city of one of the major imperial powers that's dominant in the earth at that time. And we've talked about how in Revelation 13 and in chapter 7 of Daniel, we know that there are 2 world powers that are present. There's a 10-horned world power and a 2-horned world power. Using the same imagery and symbol types, we know that the horns signify the number of nations who are involved in the establishment of each of those empires, so that one of those empires is comprised of 10 nations, or 10 earthly kings, and the other is comprised of 2 nations. So they're separate, but they're both present according to Revelation chapter 13 in the end times. And this makes sense because other places in Revelation and to some extent in Daniel as well indicate that there will be a 7th and final empire of this type that follows the pattern of the others that have come before it in the series. There's one that's the 7th one is in the end of the age. And then there is a revival of power to one of the angelic kings who had ruled one of the previous 6 empires. And so we have both the 7th empire and a revival of power to another angel through the 10 horns that give him their kingdom. So there's 2 of these happening in the end times. And this isn't particularly novel. It's fairly normative for there to have been a short or decades long transitional period between one power and its immediate successor. And so because we're talking about such a curtailed time frame in the end 7 years, that we're watching something in real terms that where there's 2 present in a particularly important period that the Bible's talking about. And so one of the things we said is that the great harlot city of the end times is likely to be the great city of the 2-horned empire, because by contrast, the 10 horns hate the harlot city. So it seems like this city is not associated with or a part of or welcomed as a part of the nations of the 10 horns. So it's most likely related to instead the other imperial power, this 2-horned beast of Revelation 13:11. It's also the case that both the harlot city and the 2-horned beast of Revelation 13:11 are responsible for false miracles, great deception, and financial power, the same sorts of things that are attributed to the great harlot city in Revelation 17 and 18. I then also stated that I believe that since each of these empires on earth has an angelic ruler that is associated with them, a satanic angelic ruler, I should say, that the 7th empire, the 2-horned beast, as we've understood that correlation, is most likely ruled by the devil himself, the chief adversary who remains in heaven, according to Revelation 12, until a period of just 1,260 days before the end of this age, before Christ's return. Both the devil, according to Revelation 12, when he's cast down, he has but a short time and he's responsible for great deception. And then we see in Revelation 17 that the 7th kingdom, which is only around for a short space as well, it is then through I think the harlot city responsible for a great deception. And so there's also a connection that we're going to see that supports this in Ezekiel 28, which discusses the idea present in Revelation 17 and 18 of this harlot city and the great merchandising and trafficking of nations and of different wares and crafts that is associated with this particular power in the end times. So there's ultimately the thing we're going to get to tonight is looking at the biblical descriptions, characteristics, geography of the 7th empire. Because there's quite a bit actually to go on there. But before we do that, I do want to provide a little more additional data on the geography of the 10 horns. We kind of briefly mentioned this in previous weeks. I just want to fill that in and do diligence there to give the biblical information on why I think the 10 horns are going to emerge in an area today we would identify as largely centered in the Middle East. Some people have in more tradition, in other traditional premillennial futurist camps, have thought of the 10 horns as either 10 regions around the globe or in particular association with a European base out of Rome. And there are reasons for that, but I think ultimately the reasons that are relied upon, particularly for the association with Rome, are misplaced in terms of the conclusion. The association with ancient Rome, as I said, is through the angel that ruled ancient Rome. As Revelation 17 explains, the 7 heads represent 7 kings. These are angelic kings because one of those kings is the king that comes out of the bottomless pit to rule. And that not only is that impossible to imagine, biblically speaking, the idea of a human being who's dead from a previous age, emerging from the bottomless pit to walk on the earth again, be resurrected in some form, something that's biblically unprecedented and has no, as far as my assessment, has no real biblical support, is that this angel is, he's identified as the angel of the bottomless pit in throughout the book of Revelation. Revelation 17 is not a novel way of referring to him. He's introduced that way in Revelation chapter 9, verse 2 and verse 11, where an angelic king who is king over the bottomless pit arises out of the bottomless pit. And then in Revelation 11:7, it refers to him simply as the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. And then in Revelation 17, it refers to him as the beast that was and is not, or was not and yet is, who will ascend out of the bottomless pit. He is one of the seven kings. So all of the kings are angels. They each rule an earthly empire. That's why Revelation 12's depiction of the dragon is seven-headed with 10 horns, as well as the earthly empires that they rule is ultimately a seven-headed series with 10 horns, because the angels rule the earthly empires. They have patronage, some kind of particular association over each empire. And so these are angels, and I believe that just as the angel of Rome, who is ruling at the time John receives the vision, according to Revelation 17, verse 8 through 11, that he will ascend out of the bottomless pit at the end of the age and rule an empire of the 10 horns. And even though his previous empire was centered initially out of Italy in Europe, if you look at the history of the Roman Empire, its center of power migrates eastward to modern day Istanbul, what was called Constantinople in Turkey. And then their power base included that sort of strip or region of area from Turkey all the way down through Israel, and subsequently through the nations between Turkey and Israel as well. And so the empire, his power, this angel's power, migrates over the centuries eastward. We saw that many of these empires migrated from one region where they started to a very different part of the world where their power extends or ends. And sometimes that includes their central cities moving, or their power base moving to a different location, as in the case of Rome. So I think what's happening here is that when his power, this angel's power, is restored to him, it's in that easterly area over in the Middle East, extended down from Turkey across Syria, Iraq, over towards Iran, through Lebanon, and down into northern Israel, and in maybe some other associated countries over there, rather than returning back to the older original area where his power started. And so the geographic association of Rome allows for an easterly orientation without requiring a European resurgence. And so there, beyond that reasoning, there is also biblical geographic information that points in that direction. So this includes the references in Daniel to the little horn, which occur in chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 11. This little horn emerges at the time of the 10 horns, which we know are end times kings or nations who give their power to the beast, the angel that ascends out of the bottomless pit. And so in Daniel, we have this statement in Daniel 7, I considered the 10 horns. In verse 8, and beheld there came up, or arose, same word there, arose, that I believe is used in Revelation to talk about the beast ascending out of the bottomless pit. He arose among them. The little horn arose among the 10 horns. So that means that he's a contemporary of theirs, but it also indicates geographic similarity, right? He's in the middle of them. He's sort of in their same region. And so then he subdues 3 of these nations, and then he becomes the ruler of all 10. And so I have in the text that's on the screen, and I'll make this bigger so you guys can see it, I've called out the particular Greek words that are used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament that existed well before and during the New Testament into the early Christian period, that was highly used. And I'm just going to compare this to something that you see in 2 Thessalonians. In 2 Thessalonians 2, when Paul's talking about the coming of the Antichrist, who most Christians associate with the little horn, and I would agree with that association, and he ultimately talks about the devil's work to prepare the way to come before him through lying signs and wonders. He says this, in verse 7, for the mystery of iniquity does already work. Only now he who lets will let until, and then this is the statement that I think is interesting in comparison to Daniel 7:8, until he, this is how it's translated in King James, until he be taken out of the way. Now I'm going to show you in the Greek what these words actually are in that final sentence. It's genomai, which is the Greek word to come, to become, to arise. Taken out of is ek, which means out or from, and then mesos is the Greek word for middle. And so when you look at that and you look at it in comparison to Daniel 7:8's reference to the little horn that emerges or rises up among the 10 horns, it's almost identical in the actual words that it uses, but certainly in the meaning of both of these phrases, that both Daniel 7 and 2 Thessalonians 2:7, Daniel 7:8 and 2 Thessalonians 2:7 use the phrase mesos for middle. They use different prepositions for from, but both words mean from or out of, and then similar words, different words with similar meaning to arise. So Paul does this sometimes. He'll translate directly quoting the Septuagint, and sometimes he'll just do an alternative translation. And I think that's what's happening here, that what Paul is saying in 2 Thessalonians is that ultimately the Antichrist does not come, he's not allowed to come until the little horn arises out of the midst of the 10 horns. That makes complete sense if you look at the language and you start talking about someone being withheld. Well, the language of Daniel chapter 10 in particular has the idea of the godly angels and the wicked angels over these nations struggling with one another, withholding one another. Even in Revelation 7, we have the idea of the four winds of heaven being withheld. And we talked about that in terms of in our four horsemen study. So I think that these are both expressing the same thing. And so what happens is that the Roman Empire of the ancient world, which moved eastward after it sort of separates into eastern and western portions, and then the eastern portion really becomes the heir to the Roman power. It's centered in Turkey, and then it holds power from Turkey down to northern Israel. And then the Bible also indicates that not only does the little horn emerge among those 10 horns that come out of the Roman Empire somehow, that I think it's particularly in the eastern area of the Roman Empire, but in chapter 8 of Daniel, it indicates that the little horn actually emerges among one of the horns that comes out of Alexander the Great's Greek Empire. Well, Alexander's empire quickly being divided among his 4 generals after his death, one of those generals, in fact, one of the 2 most powerful generals, ruled from Turkey southward down into Israel. And then the other was out of Egypt. And so you had the Ptolemies down in Egypt, and then the Seleucids out of the area of Turkey from the north down towards Israel. And so they became the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And that's the language that's in Daniel 11's discussion as he presents the series of these interactions between the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And he ultimately arrives at the final king of the north at the end of chapter 11, in a figure that most Christians, again, including myself, think is referential to the Antichrist himself. And so that's important because by looking at the association that is provided in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, it helps us refine our understanding of the geography. If we just had the association of the little horn with chapter 7 of Daniel's 10 horns, its 4th beast, which is generally understood to be Rome, then we would want to put that little horn and the 10 horns somewhere over by Rome, Italy. But with Daniel 8, we know that the association should come as well with the Greek empires that came out of Alexander the Great. And that shows that the alignment, the component of Rome that is the most important, is the one that overlaps the Greek Empire, which preceded it. And that shows this area that was predominantly occupied by the kings of the north, which is why Daniel 11 can trace this guy's emergence through them. So that pinpoints this area in the Middle East predominantly. And so that's pretty helpful. An additional passage on this in the Old Testament comes out of Ezekiel 38. We're going to look at the book of Ezekiel later this evening. But in Ezekiel 38, we have what is identified as the Gog-Magog war, understood, again, by most premillennial Christians to refer to a conflict that occurs in the end of the age before Christ returns with certain nations led by the Antichrist, and a conflict with the land of the people of Israel, the nation of Israel. And I would agree with that, although there's particulars of that story and the timing of it that I might disagree with other premillennial futurists. I do agree that that is what Ezekiel 38 is talking about. And it includes a discussion of those who are associated with this army that invades Israel or seeks to invade Israel, which we all identify with the Antichrist. And it identifies the nations that are with him, that are confederate with him. Daniel 11 seems to indicate that there is some kind of an alliance with the Antichrist of others. And so in Ezekiel, he's pretty specific. He says, Gog and Magog, Meshech, Tubal, and Gomer and Togarmah. Actually, of Togarmah, it says of the north. So Ezekiel's of the same time period as Daniel, who gives us the idea of the kings of the north. And so all of those references, Gog, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah, were understood historically and biblically to be areas in what is called Asia Minor, Anatolia, or today we would call it Turkey. So that is pretty informative, that we're talking about the area of southeastern Turkey into northern Iraq over sort of towards Iran, where those countries all come together, Syria as well. And incidentally, the term Gog is understood by many, and I would agree with this, to be equivalent to the term Caucasus. So we would have the Caucasus Mountains, right? That's right in that area, the region of the Caucasus, where you talk about the people groups that come out of that area. Those are you just substitute the C's and the G's, which are considered to be phonetic cognates. They're equivalent depending on what language you're talking about. So it's this area between the Black and Caspian Sea, is just around that area. And so you can see why the book of Ezekiel is pinpointing the geography of this as well. And then it indicates in Daniel 11:43, as well as in Ezekiel, that with these nations from that area are Persia, which is equivalent to modern day Iran in many ways, Ethiopia, which is an area south of Egypt, and Libya, which is west of Egypt, are all included. So between the references to Persia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, and areas of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, that's why I would say that this is most likely a Middle Eastern power group, that the 10 horns are 10 nations from that area where Rome and Greece, the ancient empires, overlapped ultimately in terms of where they reigned and ruled, rather than forcing a resurgence to go westward to the earlier part of the Roman period, which is not necessary historically or biblically. So that's why I would pinpoint the idea of the 10 horns and the resurgence of power to the angel that arises out of the bottomless pit as a Middle Eastern, likely to be a Middle Eastern based power. And other authors have started to come to that conclusion as well. We've been on this point of view since I said early 2000, 2001. So that's informative. And so once we have those indicators at least in mind, to be aware of that, may not be absolutely conclusive, but those are the indicators we have. Then we can start to talk about, okay, well, what about the geography of the two-horned beast? Where is that at? How does that play into this? And that's where we're going to find what I think is a good amount of biblical information that unfortunately, there's just not a lot of people in my experience who are talking about this, because most people handle the two-horned beast of Revelation 13 as a completely different kind of thing, rather than handling it in terms of the consistency of the biblical use of the term beast and horns to refer to earthly kingdoms made of different nations, two horns being two nations that comprise this empire, an earthly kingdom, just as the 10 horns are 10 nations that comprise ultimately the empire of the Antichrist. So because most Christians don't take the two-horned beast to be a political group in the same way that these other animal symbols are used in Daniel and Revelation, they don't look for the kind of indications that I think we can find pretty easily in Revelation about this. The other factor here is because they take the two-horned beast to simply be a purely singular religious individual of significance rather than a political power. And I'm not denying that it will have that it'll have spiritual or religious significance, that there will be a human leader that is making something of religious significance, proclamations and false miracles. But I think it's a defect to remove that leader from the political context of the symbol. And so the other component is, as we've identified, that the harlot city is a common theme in the Bible for the great cities of each of these empires, that what we're really talking about in Revelation 17 is the discussion of the great harlot city of one of the two empires of the end times, which I said is not likely to be the 10 horns who hate this great city. So imagining if the great harlot city is associated with the 10 horns, they're destroying their own capital city. That's less easy to believe, less naturally intuitive or reasonable than to think about them destroying the capital city of their predecessor, the seventh empire. Because as each of these empires emerges and becomes dominant, they're usually historically have done so by overcoming the predecessors, invading their main city. For example, the Babylonians came into Nineveh. The Persians came into Babylon. It's the normal trending, right? The Babylonians did not destroy Babylon. The Assyrians did not destroy Nineveh. They went to the power that was before them and conquered their city. So I think that's what's happening here. And so in that respect, we can look at chapter 17 and chapter 18 of Revelation and the harlot city and the descriptions that are there, and find a great deal of information about the nature of the seventh empire through the descriptions we have of what I believe is the great harlot city, the leading city of that seventh empire, that two-horned empire. And so what I want to take some time to do tonight, and we're going to read this and kind of skim through these passages, but I do want to read through them, starting with Revelation 17 and 18, and then read through Isaiah 23, as well as several chapters of Ezekiel, to see what I think is an astonishing set of parallel statements that Revelation 17 and 18 is describing this great city of the seventh empire in terms that are already established in the Bible in relation to another world power and group of people. And I want to say up front that I don't believe that these references are meant to refer to this ancient people that the Bible uses as if to say, well, this is the group, but to say that this end times kingdom at least has the same sort of characteristic features or things that define that group, that made it significant or unique in its own period. And that's the way that it uses this language. And hopefully you guys can see what I mean when I get there. So first and foremost, I'm going to pull up Revelation chapter 17, and particularly chapter 18 is what we're going to spend our time on. We've already looked at Revelation chapter 18 to a certain extent. I'm sorry, chapter 17, about the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth, that Revelation 17:18 ends with. And then we start with chapter 18, verse 1. After these things, I saw an angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, is fallen. So he's about to tell us about the destruction of this great harlot city, Babylon, that has just been mentioned in chapter 17. This is not the city of Babylon any more than Peter is writing about the city of Babylon. It's a sort of title that is applied using Babylon sort of as the template, right? Daniel starts, this imagery that we're starting to get comes from Daniel, and Daniel starts with Babylon every time, the Babylonian Empire. And so that they use Babylon as their reference point, as a sort of model for what would happen in the empires that came after it. And so he's about to tell us the destruction of this great harlot city of the seventh empire. Babylon has fallen, it's become the habitation of devils, the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Verse 3, for the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out from her, my people. You be not partakers of her sins, and receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Reward her as she has rewarded you, and double unto her, double according to her works, a cup which she has filled to double. How much she has glorified herself and lived deliciously, and so much torment and sorrows she give her, for she has said in her heart, I am a queen, I am not a widow, I will not see sorrow. Therefore shall the plagues come upon you in one day, death and mourning and famine. In verse 9, this is where we start to get some of the particularly interesting language that we're going to see repeated in the Old Testament prophet passages that we're going to look at. Verse 9, the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her, they will bewail and lament her, for when they see the smoke of her burning, and they will stand afar off in fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, the great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is your judgment come. And all the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. And the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones and of pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and thyine wood and all manner of vessels of ivory and manners of most precious woods and brass and iron and marble and cinnamon and odors and ointments, frankincense. And he's going on here with this list of things, right? And it says all of these things. Verse 15, the merchants of the earth were made rich by her. They will stand afar in fear of her torment. Alas, the great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, for in 1 hour her great riches have come to nothing. And every shipmaster and all the company of ships and sailors, and as many as trade by sea, they stood far off. And they cried at the smoke of her burning, saying, what great city is like unto this great city? So I'm not going to keep reading. Talking in verse 22 about the voice of the different craftsmen and musicians who are no longer going to be found in this city, right? So there's these kind of interesting things, like why are we talking about shipmasters and people who trade by sea and merchantmen and people who sell things and all the particulars? Well, because those are the attributes of a very particular type of world power that has existed in world history at one particular point, that had particular associations with these unique things. And I think it's these characteristics that will be present in the great city and the seventh empire that it is part of. So yeah, we have world trade today, but there are particular nations that are more prominent in that, in having established that world trade over the last few centuries than others. And there are particular ones that are more prominent today. And if the world goes on for 500 years, there may be other ones that are more prominent in the future, but there certainly were in the past. And the Bible is trying, I think, here to draw upon that and say, look at this type of behavior. These are the things that this country, this nation, this kingdom will be known for. And in fact, it's two nations that are two horns that form this kingdom in the way that the Medes and the Persians came together to form their empire. And so that's the language coming out of Revelation chapter 17 and 18. And now I'm going to go to Isaiah. And here's where we're going to find very similar things, but here applied to a specific predecessor in the ancient world from the 8th century before Christ, in the time of Isaiah. And it starts off, I know I'm reading fast, it's just so that we can get through the language and we can cover this. The burden of Tyre. Tyre, Tyre, is a particular city on the coast of Lebanon, modern day Lebanon, north of the area of Israel. And it says, "Howl, you ships of Tarshish." So Tarshish, if you look at this in the Hebrew, it'll tell you from the lexicon, is associated with particular individuals, but it is considered to be, as a geographical reference, to the city of the Phoenicians in the distant part of the Mediterranean Sea, either at Cyprus, which is closer to Greece, or even as far away as Spain. There are places in Spain with a name that is similar to that. And so this whole chapter is going to be about the Phoenician people, what scholars call the Phoenician people, and the city of Tyre and its associated cities, and the culture of their rule, their nation, their civilization. And what we're going to find out is that the modern term Phoenician that we see here in the lexical entry is a reference to a particular group of Canaanite people. They're the same as the groups of people the Bible refers to as the Canaanites. Now, this particular group is centered north of Israel rather than in the land of Israel that we're more commonly familiar with them there, but they were up further north as well. And so it says, this is the burden of the city of Tyre, which was initially the great trading city of the Phoenicians. And then it talks about the ships, right? We saw the mention of ships from afar off in Revelation that are mourning for the destruction of a great city. Same thing here. And then it says, from the land of Kittim is it revealed to them. So Kittim is going to be an important term we're going to focus in on here in a second. But listen to the language and see how this compares to what we read in Revelation 18. It says, "Be still, you inhabitants of the islands, thou whom the merchants of Zidon," so Zidon was an associated city of the Phoenicians nearby in the area of modern day Lebanon, and that have passed over the sea and been filled. So they traveled about the seas, filling themselves, and by the great waters of the seed of Sihor, the harvest of the river, the revenue, and she is a mart of nations. This is a great trading power, commercial power. Be ashamed, Zidon. Zidon is again a powerful Phoenician trade city. For the sea has spoken, saying, I travail not, nor do I bring forth children, nor do I nourish young men or bring up virgins. As the report concerning Egypt, so they will also sorely pain at the report of Tyre. Pass over to Tarshish. That's over to a more distant westerly location, you inhabitants of the isle. So the Phoenicians, their empire starts in the area of Lebanon, and it spreads westward across all the coastal areas of Europe and northern Africa, establishing colonial cities, trade cities, city-states of their own right, bound by trade and alliance to the Phoenician conglomerate civilization. And so this whole chapter here is a discussion of the pending destruction of the main city of the Phoenicians on the mainland, its original city, Tyre, and how that city that is a mart of nations that listen to verse 8, in verse 7, this is your joyous city, whose antiquity is of ancient days. Her own feet will carry her far off, so she's going to move. That's an interesting idea, right? The city is moving. We'll talk about what that means when Tyre is destroyed. Who is taking counsel against Tyre, the crowning city? Whose merchants are princes, whose traffickers are the honorable men of the earth. The Lord of hosts has purposed it. Pass over thy land, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more strength. He has stretched his hand over the sea and shook the kingdoms. And the Lord has given a commandment against the merchant city to destroy the strongholds thereof. Pass over to Kittim. And so the strength of Tarshish, of the Tyrians, is laid waste, according to verse 14. And then it talks about this in verse 15. It will come to pass that Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, according to the days of one king. After the end of 70 years, Tyre will sing as a harlot. Take a harp and go about the city, thou harlot. So think about the parallels here. They're talking about verse 17. Tyre will commit fornication with the kingdoms of the world and her merchandise, and it's talking about that. So the language here is very similar. So now we can say, okay, well, seems like Revelation is tying in the harlot city, or at least the nature of this great city in the Seventh Empire, with this idea of a seafaring power that is very strong in terms of its naval power and its focus on trading, and it's moving westward across the Mediterranean world. That's what's being referenced to, at least through the comparison to Isaiah. And so then that takes us into Ezekiel. And Ezekiel's got several chapters that are relatable to this, and we're going to go through them again. And predominantly, the most important one is chapter 28, but we'll see some of these associations that are important in chapter 26 and 27, and I won't spend as much time on this, but the Lord comes to Ezekiel and says, "Son of man, because Tyre has said against Jerusalem, aha, she is broken, and she's turned unto me, and I will be refilled because Jerusalem is laid waste." And God says, "Behold, I am against thee, Tyre. And I will cause nations to come up against thee as the sea causes its waves to come upon you. And I will destroy Tyre and break her towers." And then it talks about the coming destruction of Tyre and the spoil of Tyre, and the songs of Tyre will cease. That's something we see in Revelation chapter 18. And the slaughter, and it says all the princes of the sea will come down from their thrones, and they'll throw off their robes and put off their broidered garments, and they'll clothe themselves with trembling and sit upon the ground and tremble at the moment and be astonished at thee. And they will take up a lamentation for thee and say, "How you are destroyed, who was inhabited of seafaring men, the renowned city that was strong in the sea and her inhabitants." So they're astonished, and the isles will tremble at her fall, right? So this is very similar, and you can read through the rest of the chapter and see the similarities to Revelation 18, and we'll move right into chapter 27 of Isaiah. Now the Lord came to me saying, take up a lamentation of Tyre. Thou art situated at the entry of the sea, and you are a merchant of the people for many islands. Thy borders are in the midst of the sea, and thy builders have been perfect in thy beauty, and they have made all thy ships of fir trees, and they've taken cedars from Lebanon. And then it talks about going to building out of ivory their benches and to the coast and to the different lands of the Kittim. So Kittim becomes this term for all of the Western European Mediterranean world itself, and particularly those who used the sea and the ocean to trade by ship. And talks about the embroidered fine linen that was from Tyre and given to Egypt, and it was spread out, the blue and the purple. And then it goes on to talk about the wise men and the merchants. And look at verse 13, Javan and Tubal and Meshach were thy merchants. So there's an interesting tie in there. It talks about their different silver, iron, lead, these things that were associated with the trade with these particular merchants of Tyre. And so I'm going to just move on down to, you can see again reference to the spices and gold and stones. Again, things mentioned in Revelation 18. And Tyre did sing in the market. And so there's some similarities there. And occupiers of merchandise and all the men of war and all the company which is in the midst of thee will fall in the midst of the sea. Right? When Babylon the Great, the harlot, falls in Revelation, it's cast into the sea. That's what happens to it. And so bitter wailing occurs as people see this destruction and then lament over the destruction of Tyre. The kings of the earth were enriched by her, by trade with her. And let's go down to starting with verse 1 of chapter 28. This is going to be the chapter that's interesting. Remember, we said each one of these earthly empires, 1 through 7, each has an angel, satanic angel, that is the patron or presiding angel or prince over that earthly kingdom. And there were 6 that have come before. The 6th of them ruled the ancient Roman Empire at the time of John the Apostle, and the book of Revelation being written by him after he beheld the vision. And so there's another one coming. There's a 7th empire coming that is, biblically speaking, only around for, it's around its power. I'll put it this way. Its power is prevalent and important to Bible prophecy in the 7-year short space of time before the end of the age, when Israel's in its land with a temple. That's the main connective point that makes each of these 7 earthly kingdoms important enough to be featured in these biblical prophetic passages. Of all the kingdoms that existed all over the world at any point in time, the only ones the Bible really singles out are 7 in particular, and what they all have in common is that they ruled and were dominant in the world, particularly in an area of the world that brought them in interaction with the people of Israel when Israel were in the land with a temple. And so there's another one coming. Who's the angel of that power? And this is where Revelation and Ezekiel 28 are interestingly relatable to one another. So this is the statement in Ezekiel 28. The word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, say to the prince of Tyre, thus saith the Lord God, because your heart is lifted up, you have said, I am God. I sit in the seat of God. In the midst of the seas, thou art a man and not God. So here he may be talking about the earthly king of Tyre. But somewhere in this passage, he switches to talking about an angel, and we'll see that becomes apparent at some point. Now, it's not exactly clear when that transition occurs, but once it occurs, it's clear that it's going on. And he said, behold, art thou wiser than Daniel? With thy wisdom and thy understanding, you have gotten riches and gold and silver in thy treasures. Because of your great wisdom and your traffic, you have increased in riches, and your heart is lifted up because of your riches. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, because thou hast set thine heart as the heart of God, behold, I will bring strangers upon thee, and the terrible of nations, and they will bring thee down to the pit. That is the abyss, them that are slain in the midst of the sea. Thou shalt die in the depths, and will no longer be a man, will be a man and not God. And he goes on to talk about this. Now, this is where it gets interesting to me beyond that. Verse 11, the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation against the king of Tyre, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, thou sealed up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God, and every precious stone was thy covering. And he mentions a bunch of precious stones and the musical instruments associated with this king of Tyre that is in the Garden of Eden. Now, in the Garden of Eden were cherubs, were angels. And some of those angels in the Bible, in the biblical description of cherubs, had animal-like faces to them. They were beastly. And Revelation uses that term to describe 7 godly angels who appear as with the faces of an eagle or a bull or a lion. And so then it immediately says in verse 14, thou art the anointed cherub. That's a term for an angel that has an animal-like face to it. And he says, I have set thee up, and thou was upon the holy mountain of God, and walked in the midst of the stones of fire. But the multitude of thy merchandise have filled the midst of thee with violence. Therefore, I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub. And then it goes on to talk about the iniquity of this cherub's traffic, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's interesting to me that there is an angel associated with the ancient Phoenicians and their cities of Tyre and Zidon and the trading power. Like when you think about these different earthly empires that are called out, they have particular, orientations, right? Like Babylon was this crowning jewel of the monarch of Mesopotamian kings. And then the Persians were kind of also prominent, but they weren't as, as much of a beacon of what this concept of ancient Mesopotamian royalty was like, according to the book of Daniel's description. And then you get down to the Romans, right? They're not really even described in Daniel chapter 2 as a precious metal. It's just iron. The brutality of the Romans, right? They passed leadership in the Roman Empire, not from father to son, but among those they thought were worthy. The emperor would adopt some other general or someone into his family that wasn't directly his son, and then they would replace him. They would reign after him. And so the Rome's power wasn't from the bloodline, but from the power of the army, the military might of its leaders. And so it's described in Daniel chapter 2, I think, with the idea of iron. And that's another feature that we see in the 10-horned beast as Daniel 7 describes it. So each of these angels has a sort of way that they characteristically rule through the earthly kingdom. And here we see a discussion of an angel that's ruling through the Phoenicians by seafaring trading as his main tenet of gaining power and spreading civilization and those sorts of things. And we're even informed here specifically that there's such an angel that was associated with the ancient Phoenicians and this way of doing business in government in the world. And Revelation invokes that nation as a reference point for how the harlot city of the 7th empire is going to be. So I don't think we can necessarily conclude that, okay, the 7th empire is somehow Phoenician, a term that would be very difficult to tie down in terms of who that means in the world today ethnically or even geographically, because the Phoenicians spread all over North Africa, all over Europe, around even by some accounts up to Britain. They started out on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean in Israel and in Lebanon. And so where are they today, 2,000 years later? I don't know. What people group is this directly associated with today? I mean, they mixed and intermarried with all of the peoples of Northern Africa and Europe and the near Middle East. So those kinds of features are difficult or elusive. But one thing we can be sure is that we are probably looking for a world power that is based upon seafaring, trade, and naval superiority. Now, if we were talking about this 400, 500 years ago, there would be certain candidates for that. If we were talking about it in the Roman period or the earlier period before that, we would be talking about the Phoenicians or even the Aegeans before them. So there are different groups that have really used this power to their advantage over different periods of time. this is an end times group that has this, so it's not clear exactly yet who that will be until you reach the end times and you go, well, who has that power? Who's exhibiting those traits now? But it's important to know that those are the traits. That's part of the modeling and the mapping and the landscaping here. So when we see this reference to Kittim in Isaiah, as well as in Daniel 11:30, where the ships of Kittim are what oppose the final king of the north that is associated with the little horn and the 10 horns, we can see the idea that not only do we have the 10 horns and the little horn, we know what that's associated with, the 10-horn beast, but we also have the ships of Kittim, the Mediterranean seafaring Western naval power presented there, potentially in Daniel 11. It's certainly here in Isaiah 23 and in Ezekiel. The term Kittim, we see it spelled sometimes with a CH, but it's still pronounced Kittim. Generally speaking, it's a term in the Bible in the Hebrew language for all islanders of the Mediterranean Sea, and it doesn't just mean those who lived on islands, but those who lived on the coastal regions. And so it's generally Westerners who inhabited the areas around the Mediterranean Sea. The sea, particularly those who used the sea as part of their culture and their trade. And so this is from like Wikipedia on Kittim. In the Hebrew Bible, the name seems to have employed with flexibility, often applied to all the islands of the Aegean and even to the West in general, but especially the seafaring West. The expression, the Isles of Kittim in the book of Jeremiah and Ezekiel indicates some centuries prior to Josephus, the designation had already become a general description for all of the Mediterranean islands. Now that went pretty far as the Phoenician culture. They had gone pretty far west. In fact, one of their cities is, Carthage, which is very far west. But if they had, different colonial settlements in Spain, that's about as far west as you can go. And as I said, some people believe they even made it up to Britain. That was certainly a very popular view among historians and archaeologists a century and a half ago. So what do these parallels indicate? Because it seems like there's clear parallels here between Revelation 18's description and places like Ezekiel 26, 27, 28, Isaiah 23. So what's being invoked is that at the least we're talking about a world power that has a great naval power and has relied upon seafaring trade as its sort of stock and trade to become powerful and influential in the world. And so when we go and we can study more about this by studying up on the Phoenician culture itself and see what more details we can get and what else that can tell us as we look eventually to another kingdom in the end of the age, if we live to see that models those same features or characterizations or modes of operation. Right? There are world powers that have existed in history and even today that are not predominantly a naval seafaring trading power. There are some that have been, right? And so that's a particularly important piece of information to keep in mind when we consider this and we try to study and be watchful. So kind of I'm debating with myself. I think I'm going to stop here. And then next week, we'll have a good deal of material that we can get into on first learning more about the Phoenicians. And then as we learn more about the Phoenicians, we can kind of start to build those details into the model. Alongside that, then we will discuss more recent history. And, as we track across the timeline from the ancient biblical sequence of empires to the future when Christ will come and we use these symbols, we can maybe get an idea of where we're at in that timeline, or where if Christ were to come back soon, where these features are exhibited today. And again, that will be more speculative, but we're just using a biblically derived model. And then we're saying, well, if it happens soon, maybe this is where we would be looking. But with the identification of the 10 horns as predominantly a Middle Eastern people, we can probably rule out that region as the main region of the two-horned empire. But it seems obvious that the two-horned empire, in order to qualify, has to have some interaction and power in relation to the people of Israel in the land, right? That would be something that's required of all of these kingdoms. So I think that's why in Daniel 11, some have seen the reaction between this king of the north that's associated with the little horn and the 10 horns, and the ships of Kittim, which are opposing his efforts, his campaigns, his desires, and they stop him. So that would point in some respects to some kind of an association with this ancient biblical people, right? So like if you're talking about, this will be the last thing I say tonight on this, but if you're talking about how a prophet like Daniel or Isaiah is going to be given information about a people group that isn't prominent in their world and won't really be prominent in the world for another 26 or 2,800 years, then how do they describe that, right? Like, how would the prophet Isaiah describe a group of people whose power is not yet in existence, right? It's challenging terminologically because they have to depict this in a way that could be understood through the language that they knew and could use, right? It's not like, for example, let's say that that Isaiah meant to pinpoint, let's say they meant to pinpoint France. And I don't think they meant to pinpoint France, but how would Isaiah pinpoint France? France is not a country or a people group that is part of the available language known to the ancient world or important in the ancient world. So he's not going to be able to use the word France. So it's going to have to be told through comparisons to other people groups or geographic similarities. And so that geographic similarity will be told not by using the term France, by using terms that were available to him. And so, you know, let's say that they're trying to describe someone in South America, which I don't think, again, is what he's describing, but how would Isaiah describe a people group in South America? There is no people group that he's aware of, language that he could use to describe South America. He's going to have to use associations and things that are extrapolations or relate to this. And so it's along those lines that I think Isaiah's description, Ezekiel's description of the Phoenicians are being pulled into Revelation 18, not because it's like, oh, look for the Phoenicians, a group that hasn't really existed and is barely identifiable ethnically or regionally anymore in any way. For a long time, it hasn't been. It's saying they're going to be like that. There's something about that that is informative for you. And so we can at least draw a baseline and see what that means. So I'll stop here tonight. We're at 1 hour, and then we'll resume next week with looking at more information about some of this stuff. So let me pause the recording, and then we can do some discussion if people want to do it, and then we'll do prayer requests. So give me 1 second here.